Ever hear of Photon OS? No. Well, get ready to, because this unassuming piece of software, uh, it underpins a lot of the cloud services you probably use every day, and its future.
Hmm.
Yeah, it just got a whole lot more interesting.
Yeah, it's true. Photon OS is one of those like behind the scenes technologies, it rarely gets talked about, but it plays a crucial role, especially in the world of cloud computing.
We're diving deep into this today. We've got a stack of research, analysis, all that good stuff. What we're trying to figure out is what happens to this hidden gem now that the company behind it, VMware, has been acquired by Broadcom.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? To understand why this is such a big deal, we need to start with like what Photon OS even is and why it matters.
All right, let's get into that. For those of us who aren't, knee-deep in server tech every day, break it down. What is Photon OS and what makes it so special?
Imagine this. You're building a house, right? And you need a strong, reliable foundation. That's what Photon OS is for complex software applications, particularly in the cloud. It's a Linux distribution, essentially a tailored version of the Linux operating system, but specifically designed for efficiency, speed, and security.
Okay, so it's like the foundation for a very specific type of house, the kind that holds all our data and run those apps we depend on.
Exactly. Think of it like this. Increasingly, applications are packaged and run in these self-contained units called containers. Photon OS is often the base layer on which these containers run, providing them with the resources they need without any unnecessary bulk. It's like building that house with only the essential materials, making it super efficient.
So less is more in this case. It's about being lean and fast, especially for things running in the cloud.
Precisely. And this efficiency is a big part of what made Photon OS so attractive to companies like VMware in the first place.
Now, you mentioned VMware, and that brings us to the big news that sort of kicked off this whole deep dive. Broadcom.
Mm.
They recently acquired VMware, and that's got a lot of people wondering what's going to happen to Photon OS.
Rightfully so. Broadcom is a major player, but their focus has traditionally been hardware and enterprise software. They're known for their, shall we say, pragmatic approach to business, which often translates to a focus on maximizing profitability.
And that's where things get interesting, because Photon OS is open source, meaning it's free to use and modify. That doesn't quite sound like a typical Broadcom move, does it?
It doesn't, which is why there's so much speculation about what this acquisition means for Photon OS and, more broadly, for the world of open source software.
Okay, so we've got this powerful, efficient operating system that's become pretty popular, especially for running things in the cloud. But now it's under the umbrella of a company known for its proprietary approach.
Exactly, and that's the tension we're going to unpack. How will Broadcom handle this open source asset? Will they try to monetize it directly, potentially alienating the community of developers who've made it what it is? Or will they find a way to leverage its popularity to their advantage in a way that doesn't stifle its growth?
I'm sensing some tough decisions on the horizon. And the ripple effects,
Yeah.
yeah, they could be huge. But before we get into all that, let's step back for a moment.
Good idea. Sometimes a wider lens helps bring things into focus.
Before we get lost in the what ifs, let's zoom out for a second. If I'm not like a developer or a tech company, why should I care about what happens to Photon OS?
Yeah.
It all sounds like a very, inside baseball kind of debate.
That's a fair point. But here's the thing. Even if you've never even heard of Photon OS, the outcome of this situation, it could impact you in ways you might not expect.
Okay, I'm listening. Connect the dots for us.
Think about all the services you rely on that run in the cloud, right? Video streaming, online shopping, social media, even things like banking and healthcare. Many of these services rely on the very technologies we're talking about: containers, Kubernetes, and the operating systems that underpin them.
So you're saying that changes to Photon OS, they could trickle down and affect the performance, security, and maybe even the cost of these everyday services.
Exactly. It all comes down to how Broadcom chooses to handle this. Let's dive into the different possibilities that our sources have highlighted. On one hand, you have experts saying Photon OS is too valuable to just kill.
Too ingrained in VMware's moneymakers to just scrap.
Precisely. We're talking about things like VMware's vCenter, their NSX platform. These are big ticket products for them, and they rely heavily on Photon OS, not to mention the growing importance of Kubernetes.
Right. We can't forget about Kubernetes.
Yeah.
Everyone seems to be talking about it these days.
And for good reason. It's become like the gold standard for managing all those software containers we talked about, and Photon OS is a natural fit for running Kubernetes clusters. So killing it off, that would be a risky move for Broadcom, especially when you consider the potential backlash from the open source community.
That's a good point. It's not like they can just make a big change like that without repercussions. These are passionate communities with a lot of influence in the tech world.
Absolutely. But here's the other side of the coin. Broadcom has a history of leveraging their assets for profit. Some experts believe they might try to make Photon OS less open source, pushing toward a more commercial model.
Okay, so instead of being completely free to use and modify, they might introduce paid versions with premium features or support.
Exactly. And that could have a ripple effect throughout the ecosystem. It might mean less community involvement, slower innovation, and potentially even security risks if the open source community loses interest or trust.
That makes sense. If fewer people are looking at the code and contributing to its development, there's a higher chance that vulnerabilities might slip through the cracks.
Precisely. And let's not forget the potential impact on competition. Right now, Photon OS plays well with a lot of different technologies and platforms. But if Broadcom decides to integrate it more tightly with their own ecosystem, it could limit choices for businesses and developers.
So it's a balancing act.
Hmm.
They've got this powerful, popular platform on their hands, but the path to monetizing it isn't exactly clear-cut. On one hand, they've got to answer to their shareholders and show a return on their investment, but on the other hand, alienating the open source community, that could backfire spectacularly.
It's a classic dilemma, and there are strong arguments on both sides.
So where do you think this is headed? What's your take on all of this? It's like they're trying to, thread a needle. Keep the open source folks happy, but also find a way to make Photon OS fit into, Broadcom's broader strategy. What's your gut feeling on how this plays out?
Honestly, it's too early to say for sure.
Yeah.
Broadcom has been playing their cards close to their chest. There are whispers and rumors, of course, but nothing concrete. And that's part of what makes this so fascinating.
It's true. The suspense is killing me.
Yeah.
But even without knowing the ending, it feels like this whole situation is like a bit of a microcosm of a much larger story playing out in the tech world, right?
Exactly. This tension between the open source ethos software being freely available, collaborative, and the realities of big business, the need for profit, it's at the heart of a lot of these debates.
Because, let's be real, if I'm Broadcom, I didn't just drop, billions of dollars to acquire VMware out of the goodness of my corporate heart, right? They see potential.
Absolutely. And there are different schools of thought on how to unlock that potential. Some companies buy into open source projects with the idea of becoming a major contributor, building goodwill in the community, and hoping that translates into wider adoption of their other products and services.
A longer-term play. More about building trust and influence.
Exactly. But then you have the opposite approach, which is more about control. That's where you see companies taking something that was once open and trying to put walls around it. Proprietary features, paid tiers, that sort of thing.
Which can be a gamble, right? Because if you alienate the original community that made the software great, you risk, stifling innovation and driving people to alternative solutions.
Precisely. And that's the tightrope Broadcom has to walk. They have this powerful tool in Photon OS, a tool that a lot of people love and rely on precisely because of its open source nature. But finding a way to monetize that without killing the golden goose, that's the challenge.
No easy answers then.
Yeah.
But for our listener who's probably navigating a world increasingly driven by software they don't see, what's the takeaway here? What's the message we want to leave them with?
I think the key takeaway is this. Pay attention to the software that powers your digital life. It's easy to take these things for granted, but understanding where they come from, who controls them, and what their underlying values are open, closed, somewhere in between, that's becoming more and more important.
Because these decisions, whether it's about, a niche operating system like Photon OS or something more widely used, they have real-world consequences.
Absolutely. They shape the digital landscape, influence innovation, and ultimately impact the choices available to us as consumers, as users, as citizens of this increasingly digital world.
Well said. And on that note, I think we've given our listener plenty to think about today. A big thank you to you, as always, for breaking down this complex topic with such clarity.
Always a pleasure. It's these kinds of conversations, these deep dives, that help us make sense of the ever-evolving world of technology.
Couldn't agree more. To our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Photon OS and the uncertain future it faces. Keep those questions coming, stay curious, and we'll catch you on the next episode as we unpack another fascinating corner of the tech world.